And if we exclude the energy, the oil that we ship down 4.3 million barrels a day to keep cars going.
If they want to try to annihilate Ontario, I will do anything, including cutting off their energy.
This is unnecessary, and we do have to retaliate. And I apologize to the American people. It's not you. It's your president that's causing this problem.
The global energy map has shifted. In early 2025, President Trump shocked world markets by imposing a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas imports. Intended to protect American energy jobs, it instead unleashed global chaos. By May, Trump expanded tariffs, 25% on most Mexican and Canadian goods, and a 10% tariff on most global imports. Canada immediately retaliated. Ontario Premier Doug Ford warned of cutting electricity exports to 1.5 million U.S. homes and blocking vital nickel shipments. Canada fast-tracked its $40 billion LNG Canada project in Kitimat, British Columbia, to bypass U.S. buyers and ship directly to Europe and Asia. Qatar, the world's largest LNG producer, announced plans to boost production from 77 to 142 million tons by 2030 and warned Europe not to impose regulatory penalties. American companies struggled. Gasoline prices soared. U.S. energy dominance began to crumble. Trump's gamble had triggered an energy war few predicted. In January 2025, President Trump imposed a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas imports. It was just the beginning. By mid-May, the Trump administration expanded tariffs, 25% on most Mexican and Canadian goods, including energy products, and a 10% baseline tariff hit most global imports. The shockwaves were immediate. It began with one bold move. In January 2025, President Trump imposed a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas imports. The administration claimed it would restore American energy independence and protect domestic jobs. Instead, it ignited a geopolitical firestorm. Ontario Premier Doug Ford responded swiftly. Ford warned that Ontario could cut off electricity exports powering 1.5 million homes in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. He also threatened to block nickel shipments, which supply 50% of the U.S. demand. Ford's defiant message was clear. Canada would not be pushed around. Canada accelerated its pivot. The $40 billion LNG Canada project in Kitimat, British Columbia, ramped up production plans. With a design capacity of 1.84 billion cubic feet per day, it provided Canada with the ability to bypass U.S. markets and ship directly to Europe and Asia. The retaliation deepened. Canada fast-tracked the $40 billion Coastal GasLink pipeline, a 670-kilometer artery connecting British Columbia's Montney gas fields to Kitimat. Massive LNG tankers, once destined for U.S. ports, prepared for transatlantic and Asian voyages. The U.S. energy sector staggered. American refineries and power plants, heavily reliant on Canadian energy, scrambled for alternatives. By May 2025, the Baker Hughes rig count had plummeted to 578 active rigs, the lowest figure since January. The sharp decline reflected turmoil in the U.S. oil and gas market. Trump's intended protectionist policy had spiraled far beyond expectation. If you appreciate detailed, fact-driven analysis on major global events, consider subscribing to our channel. Stay informed as we track the biggest political and economic shifts shaping the world. What started as an effort to reduce foreign reliance had unleashed a global energy conflict. The opening shots of an international energy war had been fired. Canada's accelerated LNG strategy became the centerpiece of its response. The $40 billion Coastal GasLink pipeline, stretching 670 kilometers from the Montney fields to Kitimat, British Columbia, went into overdrive. Gas volumes surged, and LNG carriers began historic voyages to European ports. It was the first time Canadian gas bypassed U.S. markets at such scale. The sight of fully loaded LNG tankers sailing from Kitimat to Rotterdam, Dunkirk, and Zeebrugge sent a blunt message. Canada was done waiting for U.S. policy to stabilize. European energy companies scrambled to lock in long-term deals with Canadian suppliers. Nations across the continent, desperate to replace lost Russian supply, viewed Canada as a dependable alternative. Meanwhile, Qatar acted decisively. Doha announced an ambitious 85% expansion plan to increase LNG production from 77 million tons to 142 million tons by 2030. But with its offer came a warning. If Europe's new due diligence laws penalize Qatari gas on environmental grounds, shipments would stop. The stakes soared. European officials faced a brutal choice: secure energy or risk political fallout at home. In Washington, the U.S. tried to keep pace. American LNG exports climbed 20% year over year. Over 75% of shipments headed to Europe. But infrastructure bottlenecks, outdated terminals, and limited deepwater facilities left U.S. exporters scrambling. The United States was losing market share at a critical moment. Analysts called it the most significant reshuffling of global energy supply chains in decades. Canada and Qatar had not only replaced Russia, they were now outpacing American suppliers. Trump's tariff gamble had triggered historic energy realignment that few had imagined, and none in Washington could stop. As soon as Trump's tariffs took effect, gasoline prices in eastern states soared by 20 to 40 cents per gallon. The price shock hit at the worst possible time. Families faced hundreds of extra dollars in heating and power costs as an unseasonably cold winter dragged into early spring. Consumer outrage followed quickly. Stellantis, the first major corporate casualty, reacted swiftly. The automaker temporarily laid off 900 workers across 5 U.S. facilities and paused production at plants in Canada and Mexico. The company cited skyrocketing fuel and parts costs linked directly to Trump's tariffs. Suppliers in the Midwest sounded the alarm. Small and mid-sized manufacturers struggled under rising costs and shrinking profit margins. Several warned of imminent additional layoffs if market conditions continued to deteriorate. The political backlash was immediate. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney escalated tensions by appointing Dominic LeBlanc, a vocal Trump critic, as trade minister. LeBlanc, who had previously described Trump's tariffs as vandalizing the economic relationship, pledged Canada would stand firm. The turmoil spread deeper into the American energy sector. The U.S. oil and gas rig count plummeted, with Baker Hughes reporting only 578 active rigs by May 2025, the lowest count since January. Natural gas futures surged by 8%, reaching nearly $4 per million BTUs in March, the largest price spike in years. Utility bills rose sharply across major eastern cities, sparking further public frustration. Despite mounting evidence of economic pain, the Trump administration stood firm. Officials insisted the tariffs were needed to force companies to return production to U.S. soil. The crisis was deepening. The worst many feared was still ahead. Europe moved fast. In a bold move, the EU announced it would ban all new Russian gas contracts by the end of 2025 and completely phase out existing deals by 2027. The geopolitical energy landscape had changed overnight. To bridge the enormous gap, European buyers urgently sought an additional 30 billion cubic meters of LNG to refill storage and prevent winter shortages. Qatar and Canada stepped up as the new energy lifelines. From Canada's $40 billion LNG infrastructure at Kitimat, carriers began docking at major European ports, including Rotterdam, Dunkirk, and Zeebrugge. The sight of Canadian ships replacing Russian deliveries marked a historic shift. Meanwhile, Qatar's North Field expansion project positioned Doha as an indispensable energy supplier. But Qatar's gas came with a warning. Any enforcement of Europe's new due diligence laws targeting emissions could lead to Qatar halting exports altogether. Faced with energy security concerns, Europe reluctantly accepted Qatar's terms. The EU had little leverage left. The United States tried to keep pace. American LNG exports surged 20% compared to the previous year, with over 75% of shipments headed to Europe. Yet aging infrastructure and limited deepwater facilities meant U.S. suppliers struggled to meet full demand. Major export contracts slipped away. The LNG market appeared headed toward oversupply, but Canada and Qatar insulated themselves with long-term supply deals. Trump's tariffs, intended to restore U.S. energy dominance, instead backfired. Washington faced what experts now called the worst U.S. energy diplomacy crisis in decades. As Canada and Qatar locked in European markets, America was left scrambling. The world's energy map had been redrawn, and the global consequences of Trump's gamble were only beginning. History has an uncanny way of repeating itself. In the 1970s, the U.S. faced the OPEC oil embargo, plunging the country into panic and exposing dangerous energy vulnerabilities. Nearly 5 decades later, America faces a new energy crisis, one triggered by its own policies. Trump's tariffs sent shockwaves through global markets. In 2024, the U.S. held 45% of Europe's LNG supply. By early 2025, Europe shifted decisively. Canada and Qatar, now heavily invested in infrastructure and long-term deals, filled the void. The consequences have been severe. U.S. natural gas futures surged by 8%, climbing to nearly $4 per million BTUs. American families faced skyrocketing energy bills just as an extended winter drove demand to record levels. The Biden and Trump administrations face a shared dilemma. America is racing to complete LNG terminals and expand pipeline capacity. Yet, none of these projects will come online before 2026 or 2027, leaving the U.S. vulnerable. Trump's critics argue that his tariffs backfired spectacularly, driving allies into the arms of competitors, shrinking U.S. market share, and damaging America's global reputation. Others contend that recovery is possible, but only with urgent investment and international cooperation. The stakes could not be higher. The U.S. risks becoming an energy superpower in decline. All eyes are now on Washington. Will the U.S. pivot and rebuild global energy alliances? Or will protectionism and infrastructure delays deepen the crisis? Trump's gamble has already redrawn the world's energy map. The next move will determine if America can reclaim its leadership or accept permanent second place. The world watches. Stay tuned.